Ms. Gandhi, your recent trip to the Soviet Union was certainly a very warm affair. They accorded you a remarkable reception. You were the first non-communist head of state to whom Mr. Brezhnev went out to greet personally. Why do you think he did that?
Well, I think they value India's friendship. And they feel that this is a time to show that friendship.
Well, it certainly came at a very interesting time in view of your reopening negotiations with China.
But the Soviet visit had been planned a long time ago. In fact, I was due to go there, I think, almost 2 years ago. But somehow the economic crisis or something or the other intervened.
Well, not only the economic crisis, but the actual state of emergency.
And, well, emergency itself, I don't think it did, but it was a period where I didn't want to be out of the country.
Did Mr. Brezhnev, well, Mr. Brezhnev must
Then they had their party conference, and, you know, they give a lot of time to it.
Of course.
Preparation and so on. So.
But he must have shown particular interest in your opening renegotiations with the Chinese.
I wouldn't say particular interest. Naturally, they wanted to know about it. But our point of view has been clear to them. That is, that Soviet friendship, our friendship with them, does not preclude friendship with other countries. Nor do we intend any moves we make with other countries to come in the way of our friendship with the Soviet Union.
Well, that was your father's point of view, too, and that was the basis of India's foreign policy, in theory.
Well, that remains so.
If not in practice.
Well, I think it's remained in practice also.
You characterized your father as a saint and not a politician in the least. In retrospect, do you still feel that way?
It just depends what you mean by politician, but I certainly think that he's not, he didn't conform to the ordinary conception of a politician.
You and your aunt both seem to feel that he was inclined to be too much of a Democrat.
I think he was too trusting, shall I say, because he judged others as he was himself, and as he himself would never do anything that was mean or that would be against somebody's interest. He felt that other people also would not. And in that, of course, he did prove wrong on a number of occasions because people in his own party were working against him.
He had the capacity to see, do you think, too many sides of the same question?
Yes, I think he did.
And you don't have that problem?
No, I think I also have that problem, but not to that extent.
Not to the same extent, yes. How really do you characterize yourself as a politician? I know that's a difficult question.
It is a difficult question.
But you must have you must have arrived at some point of view about it, Mrs. Gandhi.
Well, you arrive at a point of view if you think about a matter like this deeply. And I can't say that I've given it much thought, but I also, I don't think of politics as you do in the West, for instance. For me, it's not a career. For me, politics today in India is a continuation of the freedom struggle.
Yes.
We fought for certain values. We fought for certain changes in society, economic and social changes. And we haven't completed them. And we find that at every step there's so many vested interests. They're the old vested interests of entrenched privilege and so on. But there are new ones. You build an institution. And immediately the people who are employed, they have a vested interest in it. They don't want it to change, but it may not be valuable anymore. You may not need it, or you may want to change it, such as the educational system or the administrative system, to take two very big areas. But there are lots of small things also. But in a country of India's size, the most important question is the unity and the keeping together of the country. And that can only come about if these other changes take place. If every religion, for instance, feels that it has equality of opportunity, which is there in our constitution.
Yes.
But there were groups, and there are parties who would like to deny them that, who would like to...
Who would like to?
Deny them.
Yes.
This equality. Then there are other tendencies that come. Basically, there is a feeling of unity and what we call Indianness. But for political or economic purposes, people exploit caste or regional feelings, parochial feelings, language, and so on.
I noticed in one of your local papers in New Delhi the other day that your son had addressed a large group on the subject of caste.
Well, this is because it was largely a caste meeting. This is one of the lowest castes there is, you know, the sweepers.
Yes.
And although they have a much better deal now in Delhi, I mean, from the point of view of earning, largely they still are denied a lot of opportunity in most of the country. And of course, many of them now judge progress by how many members in parliament or assembly, and in that they're not represented according to their numbers.
But did I detect a slight difference of approach to the problem between you and Sanjay?
No, no.
In that he wanted them to remove themselves from that level of work, and you simply wanted them to do better in that line?
No. My approach is, I don't know honestly what he said because I didn't read it. But my approach is that firstly, work should not be confined to a particular class. And fortunately, it isn't. I mean, I can say that in my own household, there are people who are working at different levels who have come from the lowest caste. And normally they would be in this cleaning work, but we've helped to get them educated. And they are doing all kinds of other work. So we do want to break the caste barrier in that way. But those who are still working, we want their conditions to improve also. And at the same time, we want other people to feel that this is not dirty work. I mean, keeping a place clean is one of the most important parts of a national life.
I wish you would translate that idea to New York. They could use it. Mrs. Gandhi, in 1964, you didn't want to be Prime Minister. You certainly had the opportunity upon your father's death, and yet you were absolutely definite about not wanting to be Prime Minister. What changed your mind?
Well, I don't really know. I think that it was put to me that I could keep the party together, and also that I had the party support, and otherwise nobody knew what would happen, whether the other people in the field could mobilize enough support for them to have the whole party with them.
Well, of course, you didn't succeed him. Mr. Shastri became the Prime Minister.
Yes, well, I meant after him.
After that, yes. But didn't you, in fact, really want to retire to London after your father's death?
To London? Certainly not. If I was retiring, I'd retire in India, not abroad.
Because I think your son or sons were in college at the time.
Well, but that was a very brief interlude. There was no reason for my being there.
But you...
No, I wouldn't dream of living in London.
But you were prevailed upon to accept a ministerial post under Mr. Shastri.
Yes, well, for the same reason, that he felt initially that he could not give a stable government if one of the Nehrus was not in it.
Yes. Did you feel that that was something of an apprenticeship to what you ultimately...
No, not at all. On the contrary, I said, as soon as you're stable, you should allow me to resign.
Yes. But then his death, of course, was most unexpected.
Yes, very unexpected.
And you were really faced with the necessity for making a completely reversed opinion about the prime ministership.
Things happened so fast that I can't say that there was a question of thinking about it. It just, it was one thing after another, and I was capitulated into a situation.
But didn't the Congress party leaders at that point feel that, quite apart from the fact that you were the most nationally known individual in the country, didn't they feel, from their point of view, that it would be somewhat easy to control you?
Well, they may have. They didn't say so.
Well, but that was the prevailing opinion, that you would be something of a kitten in their lap. But actually, they discovered before long that you were more related to a tiger than to a kitten.
No, I don't think at all. I mean, I do like the tiger very much. I think it's a very graceful as well as a
Tenacious.
animal. No, the problem was a very practical one. That while we were proceeding in a particular direction, that is allowing ourselves to drift, the party was losing control. And you know, in the 1967 elections, we lost several states. And even in Parliament, our majority was considerably reduced. So from that point of view, one had to see, well, what had gone wrong? Why had this happened? And obviously it was because we were not going ahead in the manner that the people expected us to. So therefore, this is what created an opinion in the party that we must be much firmer about our policies. And when I put this clearly before the executive, that is when the split took place.
But that's also the time when you showed your political prowess and tenacity. After all, you had a lot of political entrenchment against you. Did you spend some pretty lonely moments at that point in your career?
No, I don't think I felt at all lonely. Because when you're doing what you think has to be done, there was no doubt in my mind at all.
But you were really fighting against deep entrenchment.
Yes, but I was not fighting against myself. If you're doing something for yourself, then you're worried whether you'll succeed or not. But when you're doing it for what you consider is your country or a larger cause, then you say, well, you have to do your utmost, and if you succeed, well and good. If you don't, it's just too bad. But you have to do your utmost.
I know you've been asked this in many different variations, but do you think your whole road since you became Prime Minister would have been easier had you been a man?
I don't really know. I don't think so. No.
You don't think you've paid a price for being a woman?
Well, maybe some people minded more a woman succeeding than they would a man. But on the other hand, they would have been against in different other ways, which perhaps they weren't.
Do you think you found it?
And certainly I have a better relationship with women.
You do have a better relationship?
Much better, yes. So, and they do form half the population.
Well, that's something in your favor then. Do you feel, or did you feel at any point that being a woman was an advantage or disadvantage in dealing with people like Mr. Nixon or Mr. Brezhnev?
No, I don't think so. I don't know about Mr. Nixon, but certainly not with Brezhnev.
It wouldn't have made any difference.
Because in the Soviet Union, women have, I mean, they may not have all some of the highest positions, but basically they have far more equality than in many other countries.
But the fact is, you are a woman, and you're also Prime Minister of India. What do you feel you symbolize for women throughout the world?
Well, I like to think of myself as a human being and not as a woman. And I think that we tend to divide ourselves into too many compartments, whether of religion or sex or something or the other. We're all human beings, and I think our concern should be for the human being. This question of rights of the people, you see, there's always a conflict, whether the rights of a few people are more important or the rights of the masses of people. This is the continuous conflict that exists, because no one can say that our newspapers are representing public opinion, for instance. They belong to a very small, entrenched group of largely big business interests. And this is the opinion they project. Now, similarly, in Parliament also, the opposition was very small. You remember that at the last election, we had a 2/3 majority.
Yes.
And yet this small minority, whom we allowed full freedom to say and do what they like, what did they use the freedom for? For character assassination, for building up situations of despair and gloom in the country, for exploiting the economic difficulties which all nations shared at that time. You know, there was inflation in the United States and all the Western world and all the developing world. And this situation was aggravated in India because we'd had the Bangladesh crisis, followed by the war, followed by 2 and in some places 3 years of very severe drought, so that we were very short of food and many other essential articles. The shortage in agricultural production always hits industry here. So there was an all-round extremely difficult situation, and in such a situation, as you know, people are depressed and frustrated, and what they need is something to hold them together, to create new hope. Well, at that time, if you project a thing that nothing has been done in India ever, nothing is ever going to be done, then the country goes down because each man feels, well, let me grab what I can just now since there's no future. Now, this is what had happened here, which had to be controlled.
Yes. But in reference to Pakistan, you've also reopened negotiations with the Pakistanis. You've already established air and rail links. I believe you've appointed an ambassador to Pakistan. Why, militarily, did you not seize the advantage that you had in the recent war with Pakistan? You could have conquered Pakistan almost totally. Pakistan has long declared its enmity toward India. Why did you not?
Well, we don't believe in conquering people.
Even an avowed enemy?
Yes, I think so. I don't think that it would have helped the situation. We believe that basically, I mean, we have accepted the fact of Pakistan. Although partition created vast problems for both the countries, we accepted the fact with all the difficulties, and largely the difficulties are, of course, there are economic difficulties, but there are also human problems. Many families are divided, close friends, and so on. But our policy always has been to have friendship, because we believe that our problems are complementary. They're not in conflict. And if we were to cooperate in solving them, well, it would strengthen both the countries. And not, it's quite wrong to say that because India is the bigger country, therefore, you know, India wants to swallow up her neighbors. We don't at all. We never have. In fact, throughout our history, we've never raised arms against any neighboring country. There have been internal fights, but never outside our borders. And this policy continues. We don't want to conquer anybody, but we do want friendship with everybody. In fact, we define our foreign policy as increasing friendship where it exists, trying to create it where it does not exist, and where there's hostility, to try and blunt it.
Well, that's certainly noble aims. There's no question about that. But do you really believe that you can have a sustained relationship with Pakistan without solving really the crux of the problem between your two countries? I have reference again to Kashmir.
You see, any problem is solved, or you can work towards a solution, when there is a spirit of understanding and a desire to solve it, not to use it, you know, as either as a stick to beat somebody with, or as a provocation, or to use it as propaganda.
But it's almost...
No solution, no problem in the world is insoluble, provided there's a desire to.
Provided indeed, but the Kashmiri problem is almost of 30 years standing. How much longer can it go on and
continue? Well, some things have gone on for years. We had a problem with Sri Lanka, which was from, I think, 1828. And finally, we sorted it out when Mrs. Bandaranaike was here a couple of years ago.
Well, then are you hopeful of a similar working out of the Kashmir problem with Pakistan?
No, given the right atmosphere, certainly all problems can be solved.
There was a quote in editorial of one of your papers here in New Delhi the other day, and I'd like to read it to you. It said, "Perhaps India should not get irritated by Mr. Bhutto's unfortunate tendency to talk about Kashmir and adopt grand postures when he visits certain countries." I wonder if they meant China. "Or gets lost in eloquence before crowds." Now, that was in the National Herald. Now, do you continue to be irritated by his references to Kashmir?
You know, I'm not a person who gets easily irritated. But why this bothers a majority of Indians is because they then ask, is he serious about normalizing relationship?
Well,
Or is he saying one thing to us and another thing to other people?
well,
It's not a question of getting irritated.
but what is your attitude toward Kashmir, Mrs. Gandhi? How do you see a possible solution coming
Well,
about?
I think that this is not the time to discuss that because it's, I mean, one couldn't deal with it in a short time.
But you still have the same conditions prevailing there that you did almost 30 years ago, and sooner or later they are going to have to be resolved.
Well, as I said, I think they can be resolved.
Now, in terms of Bangladesh and the creation of the Awami League in East Pakistan many years ago, how did you and your father view the development of the Awami League and its increased concern about autonomy for what was then East Pakistan? It must have held your interest.
Frankly, I can't say that I gave it deep thought, except that we face this problem in India, that if any community or any region feels that it is neglected, then grave problems arise. Therefore, you have all the time to watch out for the interests of any group that considers itself less privileged. I mean, that is our whole policy. And this is why from time to time we see if anything that we are doing is creating an imbalance, and then we try to correct it. And it was obvious that this sort of imbalance had come about between the two, East and West Pakistan. And I think with the show of little bit of friendship and consideration to them, they could have solved the problem. But they took quite another attitude. And then, of course, there were the elections in which Sheikh Mujib won a majority.
And for which he was imprisoned. And then released. And then after the war went to London. And then I remember that he flew from London to Delhi, where you received him, en route to Dhaka. That was a very moving moment in history.
Well, before that, hundreds of thousands of Bengalis died. And we had 10 million of them on our land, which created very grave problems of administration, of finance, of health, and finally political problems. And this is why I went to America at that time and to other European countries, because I thought they could have exerted their influence in trying to persuade the government of Pakistan to take a different type of point of view.
Now, you specifically went to the United States to visit with Mr. Nixon. Why do you think he turned you down? And he did turn you down quite cold, didn't he?
Well, I think that's a question you should ask the Americans, not me.
But didn't that really set the stage for what ultimately happened in terms of the armed conflict?
You see, what set the stage was what was happening in Bangladesh, because gradually the whole problem seemed to be moving on to Indian soil. More and more people were coming, and our border is such that we can't prevent them. And when I first said that you must stop the refugees coming, I was told, well, shall we shoot them down? Because there's no other way we can do it. And obviously we couldn't shoot them down. So this was what was creating the problem for us.
Well, then after Mujib became the leader of the new Bangladesh, it was only a relatively short time until he was assassinated. Now, what elements do you think conspired for his assassination? Because it changed the complexion of Bangladesh's relationship with India.
The relationship had changed a little bit before also, largely due to the economic difficulties to which I referred earlier. Because just as we had the shortage and so on, they had a very acute shortage. And it was very easy for them to say that this is all due to India. Because at a time when we couldn't afford to send out a single grain, we did give them 1 million tons of rice. But the propaganda there was that Bangladesh rice is being smuggled into India, whereas it was the other way around. But they went through an extremely difficult phase. And because there was this propaganda blaming it on India, it created a certain amount of anti-Indian feeling.
And Bangladesh began to tilt more towards Pakistan and towards China.
Well, I think that there was a presence there. It was not that the people just tilted, but there were individuals in positions of authority who were very much inclined that way from the beginning.
Well, now, of course, in your renegotiations with China and with Pakistan, that automatically has to affect your relationship with Bangladesh. Does it not?
Well, we hope, because this is, I mean, we've just taken some initiatives. Now we have to see how they will work out.
Well, Mrs. Gandhi, would you enlarge on what you mean in India about the term non-alignment?
Basically, it's not belonging to any military bloc or pact. Also, that each country should have independence of judgment, assessment of a situation, and of taking what, of formulating their own policies.
Well,
it does not mean neutralism.
Well, that's the point I was getting at.
Because we do remain interested in what happens in the world for the simple reason that most things affect us. But of course we don't believe in interfering in any other country's affairs.
No, but people seem to imagine that if you're friendly to the Soviet Union, automatically you must be an enemy of the Soviet Union's enemies. I'm giving that just as an example.
That is just the whole point of non-alignment, is that when we became free, the world was divided into the two Cold War blocs. Now, we felt we had far too many problems on hand here to be involved in other people's quarrels. And this was a method by which we thought we could opt out of the quarrels and opt out of the Cold War and be friendly to, even the people were hostile to each other. We could be friendly with both or however many they were. And in fact, we have been. And now you find that even those who do not entirely approve of non-alignment, they have made bridges with the opposite bloc as well as with non-aligned countries, so that those outlines that were there before of the blocs, they have been blurred.
Well, I think part of the blurring in the minds of most Americans is the fact that there seems to be something rather foreign between an Indian-Soviet relationship as opposed to an Indian-American relationship. I guess for one reason that we both come from the same common parent. Do we not?
I don't know.
Well, I mean in terms of the British. We both were spawned of the British.
Well, India, of course, has had a very long history, as you know. And the British period was a very small part of it.
In terms of your relationship with the United States, under Presidents Truman and Eisenhower, there's no question that the relationship with India was really then at its peak, was it not?
Yes, I think so.
What do you think happened under President Kennedy?
Well, I don't really know.
But something happened, Mrs. Gandhi.
I think it's the greater involvement of Pakistan in the military pacts, perhaps. And then the American government thought that, that Pakistan was an ally, whereas India was merely a friend. And therefore, greater weightage should be given to the ally. And of course, it was in President Eisenhower's time that Pakistan got all those arms. And you'll remember that my father pointed out to him that these would be used against India, whereas the Pakistan government tried to show that they would be used against the communist countries. That was a time when we were friendly not only with the Soviet Union but also with China, and Mr. Chou En-lai paid several visits to India and assured us that Pakistan had assured them that the arms would never be used either against China or the Soviet Union. So that left only us.
But then there was a further erosion under President Johnson. Now, President Johnson and your father and you maintained a very cordial relationship.
Well, he gave me a very warm welcome when I came to the States.
That's what I have reference to. What soured it?
You know, I read in a book, in an American book, that he is the one who said that there was a bias against India in the US administration. Now, we didn't even think of this until we got it from your sources.
But there was a definite souring on the part of President Johnson toward India. Now, do you not have any reason?
Well, I think perhaps he saw things in the same terms, that here was Pakistan, which was willing to do whatever the US said, and India was adopting more independent attitude, and not realizing that India's problems are very much vaster, and we simply cannot afford to take other people's assessment of them, because it's the USA can bail out the UK if there's a financial crisis. You can bail out Pakistan or Bangladesh or any country, but you cannot bail out India if it's in real trouble.
Why?
It's just too big. The money involved, the people involved, the resources involved. Now, although you mentioned earlier the great help which we've got from the US and for which we are genuinely grateful, it's only been a very, very tiny fraction of the effort that we have made for development, or the Indian people themselves have done. And this will always remain the case, that no country can help a country of our size except marginally. Therefore, the effort has to be ours. Therefore, we have to ensure that the effort will succeed. And only we are in a position to see what has to be done and when and how it has to be done.
Well, Mrs. Gandhi, you just mentioned parenthetically that India was very grateful for the assistance given to it by the United States. But many of the prevailing attitudes in the United States was that India was very ungrateful, indeed almost hostile to the United States in spite of all of the beneficence. How do you account for that?
Well, this is the propaganda that's been made. And one thing that even in my father's time, there were people here, some of the opposition parties, but even people in our own party, who were anxious to create a feeling in the US that my father was anti-US. Now, you know that he wasn't. But some of these people had access to important people there and to the business world. And they consistently spread this impression. And also the fact that we laid so much stress on socialism, I think that also perhaps had something to do with it, because some of your people don't draw a distinction between socialism and communism, whereas the two are entirely different. And our version of socialism is going to be an entirely Indian version, which meets the demands of the Indian people. Now, earlier I said the most important thing is for the country to be united and strong enough not to threaten anybody else or even to influence anybody else, but merely to solve our own problems within the country. We cannot have this unity and strength unless we tackle the problems of poverty. And you cannot solve the problems of poverty unless you look to the needs of the very poorest and the weakest and the most underprivileged of the people. This is how socialism has come in, that it's a word that is, or a description that is nearest to what we want to do. It's not the socialism that other countries are practicing.
And you feel that many in the United States took offense at the term socialism?
Yes.
All right, then what do you feel was the motive behind the United States aid to India? Do you feel it was beneficent? Do you feel that it represented dollar diplomacy? Do you think we exacted a price for what we gave you?
I'm afraid that most countries exact a price.
Uh, Getting back to India-U.S. relations, I want to read a quote to you that was in the New York Times last summer in July of 1975. It says, several newspapers in the West have special standards for India. This is your quote. Our achievements are ignored, but our shortcomings are grossly exaggerated. Do you remember making that statement?
I must have.
Now, can you
But I
enlarge?
think it's true.
Can you enlarge on that?
Well, if I can give a specific instance, and this happened long before emergency or any curbs on the press. It's when we had our drought in 1972. We went through well, difficult is hardly the word, it was an excruciating period. But the drought was at its worst on the western coast, you know, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and what was Mysore then, although it extended to other parts also. The Chief Minister Maharaj said that he would not allow any press people in the drought-affected areas. I didn't know. He just made the announcement. He just said it. Until we saw the reports abroad saying that millions were dying and therefore we were not allowing people. I phoned him up and he said, no, there's nothing to hide, only we have such a major job of organization. I can't have people, you know, walking between our legs, so to speak, you know, and interfering and so on. So I said, no, this is creating a wrong impression. Please allow them in small batches. And they went. And I know that some Western correspondents wrote exceedingly good reports, good in the sense that the situation is bad, but there was a magnificent sort of marshalling of resources and organization in trying to deal with it, and that nobody was being allowed to die and so on. Well, this report was not published, and this correspondent showed the telegram he got from his paper to our minister saying, we don't want this sort of, please send distress stories. Now, this is an attitude which we have noticed time and again. Now, that had nothing to do with democracy or anything, but this has been an attitude. Now, we have the progress in agriculture, in industry, not only the increase in production, but the diversification of industry, both in area-wise and in the type of products, range of products, is quite substantial, considering that we have all the brakes that democracy puts. That is that you have difficulty in getting the land, you have difficulty in removing the people who are there, and compensation and all kinds of things like that. But nothing of this really appears in the Western press. Even in you suddenly have a thing that nothing has been done for agriculture. Well, you know, this year our production is 116 million tons compared to only 52 in the 50s, early 50s. And this doesn't take into account 12 million tons of potatoes and other, I don't know how many of things like tapioca and so on, which are also people's staple diet.
Well, we'll get into a discussion of the economic gains under the emergency, but I do want to get back.
I'm saying from the beginning, not
from the
just,
beginning. Yes, I appreciate that. But I want to get back to the deterioration, really, of relationships between India and the United States, and ultimately gets us down to a discussion about what you feel was the role of the CIA in Indian affairs.
Now, that's a very touchy spot.
It is a touchy spot, but it certainly figured in your consideration.
Well, we can only judge the CIA and its role by what appears in the American press and books.
Well, all right, but those books and the accounts in the American press obviously have given you the feeling that there has been a CIA activity in India.
Well, wouldn't you think there would be?
Well, but I really would rather ask you that question, Mrs. Gandhi.
Well, we think that there probably has been. Now, why I'm not making a more categorical statement is that our intelligence is not such that we can prove any of these things and say such and such a thing was the action of of such and such a thing. There only is circumstantial evidence and
Now, in terms of your relationship with the Third World, and it really assumes greater significance in view of the meeting at Sri Lanka, and certainly your trip to the Soviet Union must have some bearing upon that. It's certainly the publicity attendant upon your visit to the Soviet Union certainly must have even increased your prestige in terms of that meeting at Sri Lanka. What do you really think the effect of the Soviet pact will be on that meeting?
well, there's no pact with the Soviet Union.
Well, then subsidiary agreements to the 20
well, they
Treaty
aren't
of Friendship.
even agreements. They just are the normal economic things which we have with any country, which I'm going to Afghanistan and we'll have some with them, or anywhere you go, provided it's mostly trade and I mean, we need some, no country today can be fully self-sufficient. Each country needs something and also has something to give. So this is all that we did. I can't say that there were any pacts as such. And India as a country, we are not at all bothered with prestige, you know. This is, I don't know whether it's just a Western concept or it's a Western concept that's been adopted by other countries. But for India, we can honestly say that we are not bothered about prestige at all. We could have done a great deal if we'd wanted to push ourselves forward, but on the contrary, we always stay in the background, and in other non-aligned, we have helped our smaller neighbors to come ahead and be members of the Bureau and so on.
Now, in terms of the new nations, particularly in Africa, what advice would you give to these new nations along economic, social, and political lines in terms of India's experience?
Well, I don't believe in giving people advice because most people don't like getting advice. But I do feel that the developing countries should help one another much more because that would strengthen them.
Now, the West had hoped that India would be a model for the other third world nations. The West now believes that India was such a model of corruption that it really cannot be an example to these third world countries. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'm afraid it's again a misconception and perhaps a deliberate spreading of a false image of India, because I don't deny that there was and there is some corruption here, but it's in no way more than exists in other countries, of which we see evidence again in the newspapers. And we have made a major effort to tackle this corruption. It grew a bit in those 2 or 3 years of acute shortage, because when there's a shortage, there is there's much greater opportunity to do these things.
Encouragement
and
of black
also
market.
the worst of a person's character seems to come to the surface. But we've made a major effort. We have been able to curb smuggling to a great extent, and many tax evasion and black marketeering, hoarding, all these things have been brought under control. Not completely, but at least it's a process that has